Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Center for Jewish History. My name is Joel Levy. I'm the immediate past president of the center. I just stepped down. David Myers, our new president, could not be here this evening, so he asked me to pinch hit and to welcome you all, which is a great pleasure to do. For those of you who are not familiar with the Center for Jewish History, I'd like to say just a word of introduction to this great institution, one of the treasures of the city of New York and of the country. The center is a partnership of 5 organizations: the American Jewish Historical Society, the American Sephardi Federation Leo Baeck Institute, Yeshiva University Museum, and YIVO Institute for Jewish Research. They all have collections, and collectively their collections, which are housed in this building, are the largest repository of modern Jewish history in the world. About 100 million documents, 500,000 books, and countless artifacts and objects, all of which are available for scholars and the general public to see and to study. We preserve and protect those documents and make them available through the Lillian Goldman Reading Room, which is upstairs, also through public programs such as this, through exhibition programs, which is the reason for this lecture, and so on. So it's a marvelous institution, very well known in the scholarly community, but not so well known in the general community. I'm so pleased that we have such a large audience tonight, including an overflow. Some people are seated, I know, outside in the Great Hall, where we'll have a reception afterwards, and we're so pleased that we can accommodate everybody for what promises to be a wonderful, wonderful evening. We're very, very grateful to have this magnificent exhibition, 500 Years of Treasures from Corpus Christi College, which was founded 500 years ago as one of the colleges at what we know today is the University of Oxford. And I'm not going to say too much about that because the next speaker will say a few words about that. But we're having a series of 5 lectures associated with the exhibition. There is one more after this evening, and I invite everybody to come back again on August 3rd for that, when the Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford will be speaking on how Hebrew became a sacred language. A very different kind of a topic from tonight, but another very, very interesting topic. So I'd like to move on to the program itself, and we are honored that Ralph Smith is going to be introducing the speakers in the program itself. Ralph is the president and CEO of his own company, the Ralph Smith Group, which does international consulting. He's also special legal counsel at Jones Walker, and most importantly, president of the Association of American Rhodes Scholars. He's had an extraordinary career internationally in law, education, and commerce, trade, and economic development. And he was, in 2013, appointed by Queen Elizabeth to the Order of St. John. And we have a personal connection in that regard. Some of you, many of you know that I was, for most of my life, an American diplomat, and I served in Malta, which is where that order is based, the Knights of Malta. So we have great connections. I'd like to thank the Wall Street Journal and Gerry Baker, the editor-in-chief, and of course the head of the Washington Bureau, Jerry Seib, who are here, for being the media sponsor of this fabulous, fabulous exhibition. If you have not seen the exhibition before the program this evening, please see it after the program itself. It will be open late, or if not, come back some other day and see it. It is something really to be marveled at. And with that, I'd like to turn the podium over to Ralph Smith. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joel, and what a pleasure it is to be back here for my 3rd time, and this one is particularly special. Joel, to see you again on this side of the presidential transition. Congratulations on a fabulous record here, and best wishes in the transition. And then secondly, to introduce our terrific Wall Street Journal hosts and commentators tonight, the the two Jerrys, Baker and Sidey. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here along with you. And third, because I've got my beautiful and brilliant daughter-in-law here in the audience on the first row, Graham Frankel from Long Island, now Graham Smith from Alabama, is a testament to creativity and adaptability and also a commitment to the truth. And I'm going to come back to all three of those themes as I talk just a little bit about the University of Oxford, Corpus Christi College, and tonight's program. Corpus Christi was founded 500 years ago this March, in 1517. Keep that date in mind. It was the first Renaissance college in Oxford, and its library, whose treasures we exhibit only in fractional part, was called by Erasmus the gem of Europe. Now, 1517 in England, a mere generation from the Wars of the Roses and the political instability that was caused during that period. 1517, the very year that an unknown monk from Wittenberg nailed his famous 95 Theses on the door, which touched a flame that changed medieval Europe forever, changed the church forever, changed politics forever. And Corpus was founded in the middle of that ferment. Bishop Fox of Winchester was our founding benefactor. He had been the trusted advisor to both Henry VII and Henry VIII, and in an act of great wisdom decided he would devote himself to scholarly activity and found colleges rather than continue to be an advisor to Henry VIII, which role he turned over to Cardinal Wolsey. And you know the rest of that story. Died en route to his trial for treason with a prearranged result. But Corpus Christi was founded in the Middle Ages, but as a part of the Renaissance. Matthew Arnold famously said that Oxford, whose dreaming spires echo the last memories of the Middle Ages, is really correct. But Corpus was a part of the Middle Ages. It has dreaming spires, but it also had a new idea. And the new idea was that a revival of classical learning and an application of the principles of truth and the seeking of truth was paramount in the education of young men, and it was young men at that era. But it was an exploration that really was remarkable at Oxford, because it was not only an exploration of God's Word, which was certainly very important, but in its original languages as the medieval Christians understood them. Hebrew and Greek. That's the reason that Corpus has the largest and finest collection of Anglo-Jewish manuscripts in the world, because it was a pioneer in the study of Christian scripture and the Hebrew Bible in its original languages. You'll see in this exhibit fabulous translations in all three languages. You'll see a genealogy of one of the kings of England that traces itself back to Adam and Eve. You'll see a letter from Sir Isaac Newton, who is explaining as best he could in a debate with another astronomer of the era why the comet that lit the night sky in the 17th century seemed to come back. And fabulously, among many other fabulous treasures, there's a book by Galileo discussing the moon. And unlike later editions of this book has Galileo's hand-drawn image of the moon. So the testimony of this antiquity is to the pursuit of excellence, the pursuit of truth, truth in God's Word, truth in the natural world, wherever it leads you. And sometimes that pursuit of truth leads you into dangerous territory. But the pursuit of truth goes on. The exhibit that you'll see tonight, or that you have an opportunity to see, is just a fraction of the holdings in the fabulous Corpus Christi Library. And the reason we've organized this exhibit, not only in celebration of our 500th anniversary, but because this exhibit, never before seen in America and rarely seen by anyone, is housed in a cavern underneath the quadrangle at Corpus. And we are in the midst of a £7 million campaign to make these fabulous holdings more accessible to scholars, more accessible to individuals, and I'm happy to say we're about 60% of the way there. If any of you would like to participate, would like to know more about it, let me know. I walked down from Midtown this evening, and I walked past the New York Public Library. There's a great sign, a banner, it says, "Libraries are for everyone." And that is true. Libraries are for everyone. The pursuit of knowledge is the foundation of all of our societies, and to make it more accessible to everyone is a worthy goal for all of our efforts, and without all of us, it won't happen. Now, the pursuit of truth in dangerous times is not unfamiliar to us today. Now, Henry VIII, to my knowledge, never tweeted. At least there's no record of it. But it is sure that Henry VIII, Henry VII, and the kings of England had strong opinions, and when you disagreed with them, you put your life at risk. Today, our political leaders have strong opinions. When you disagree with them, you perhaps don't put your life at risk, but you put your career at risk, you put yourself and your integrity on the line. And I am so pleased to be able to introduce Gerard Baker and Gerald Sidey, the fabulous editor-in-chief and the Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, because they embody the very best traditions in journalism, which in our country, based on the power of the freedom of speech and of the press, is a bedrock of our democracy. Jerry is himself a graduate of Corpus Christi College just a few years after I. He has the distinction of having a first-class degree, which is very, very rare at Oxford, in politics, philosophy, and economics. And I can assure you he uses all of those skills, plus a few others he learned maybe in the pub, to navigate what the current pressures are. Jerry Sidey is from the Middle West, and he has had a very distinguished career, most recently as the bureau chief for Washington's Wall Street Journal. And where could be a more central place in the world today than in Washington, D.C., with the currents that are swirling around our country. But creativity, adaptability, and the commitment to excellence and to knowledge and absolute integrity are the hallmark of both of these gentlemen. And I'm so grateful to them and the Wall Street Journal for being our exclusive media partner for this exhibit of treasures of the Oxford Library of Corpus Christi, opened first at the Folger Library in Washington and now here at the Center for Jewish History. A magnificent institution, Joel, of which you and I think we can all be very, very proud. So may I invite Jerry to come forward.
Thank you so much, Ralph. That was extremely kind of you. Very warm introduction. I should say that similarities between Henry VIII and the current President of the United States are obviously unintended. For one thing, this president's got at least another 3 wives to go before he reaches that distinction. And as far as we know, both of his first 2 have survived, have rather had better fates than Henry VIII's first wives. But it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ralph. Thank you, Joel. Thank you to the Center for Jewish History. It really is a pleasure to be here, and great for me to be associated with this exhibition from treasures from my old college, Corpus Christi College. As Ralph said, I was there a few years after him. But I feel that even though that was 30-odd years ago, I still feel very much the spirit of my college. The college, as Ralph said, was founded as very much as a Reformation college. It was the Bishop Fox who founded the college. He later became famous for founding Fox News. he founded the college on very much on humanist and by the standards of his day, liberal and progressive values. And those values, I think, have persisted. And one of my favorite graduates of my college, one of my fellow graduates who achieved rather greater distinction than I did, was General James Oglethorpe. And I don't know if there's any Georgians in the audience here, but if you are, you will know that General James Oglethorpe of my college was the founder of the colony of Georgia in the 18th century. And one of the very nice stories about him is that he founded the colony of Georgia very much on liberal humanitarian lines. And it was freedom of religion. One of the earliest synagogues it was in Georgia. There was complete freedom of religion there. And interestingly, there was no slavery in the early days of the colony. Sadly, that changed a few years after Oglethorpe ceased to be involved in the colony. But I like to think that those values of liberal values of humanism, of humanitarian, of belief in the freedom of the human spirit very much animate all of us. It's a great pleasure to be here with my colleague, Jerry Seib, for, as it was described, the Two Jerry's show. Jerry, as you know, all of you, is not only the chief commentator, Washington political commentator for us, was bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal in Washington for many, many years, twice actually, has had an extraordinarily long and distinguished career in journalism, in covering the Middle East for a long time, and also most recently, of course, having covered Washington and now our Washington commentator. He's covered, I think what's brilliant about Jerry is not only is he obviously extraordinarily intelligent and wise, he's in an age when partisanship has become so pronounced. Jerry has been really a model of truthful, accurate, objective reporting, and it's a tribute to him that he's managed to retain the trust of people in Washington and indeed of this country over the last 25 years as he's written about politics and still does today. And despite changes of administration, whatever may change in Washington, one thing can be certain is that Jerry Seib will be offering the best, most insightful, most intelligent, and most objective commentary. So it's a pleasure to be here this evening. We're going to do what we always do in these circumstances, which is have a bit of a conversation, and then really very much want to open it up for questions, for comments, observations. Please feel free to ask questions. We'll do our best to answer. Jerry, I'm going to start by actually sort of stealing a bit of a march on you in the field of Washington. As it happens, so happens today, I was in Washington today, and I interviewed President Trump in the Oval Office. And we talked about a lot of things, and I can talk to you about we'll talk about some of those things. We've just published the various stories online, wsj.com. Please go and have a look at them. There are many things we talked about. I think, and we're going to talk here about the media and truth and the challenges for the media in this modern age. First thing I do want to get onto, though, is a very topical issue. And I want to talk about some of the challenges that Donald Trump is presenting right now, not just for the media, but for Washington and for the country, and the way in which he's going about governing. We talked today a bit about his tweeting activity, which Ralph alluded to, and in particular his most recent tweets and his most recent comments about his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions. And I actually said to him, Mr. President, I seem to recall there's a famous saying that President Eisenhower was supposed to have said after he left office that he only made 2 mistakes when he was president, and they're both sitting on the Supreme Court. And I said, it sounds to me from your tweets and from some of the things you've said in the last week or so that you think you've probably only made 1 mistake in office, and he's currently heading the Justice Department. And he didn't demur from that. He didn't really dispute that. So we have this extraordinary spectacle of the President of the United States actually publicly denouncing his own Attorney General. Jerry, you've been in Washington, you've been covering Washington for a quarter of a century or more. Tell us a bit about how this extraordinary set of circumstances came about, what it means, what the president is trying to achieve here, and where you think it goes.
Well, there's this thing you say if you're in Washington now. You say, "I've never seen that before," and you say it every day. This is unprecedented. Everything is unprecedented, and so this is unprecedented. I think it starts with with a little psychoanalysis of Donald Trump. I would say that. I think there are a couple of things to remember about him. He believes very strongly, and I think correctly, that he is president because he was seen as the outsider, that he was the change agent. He was the guy who would come to Washington and drain the swamp is, I think, a cliche, but the point is what the point of the Trump candidacy was. And by the way, he ran against Hillary Clinton, who was the absolute personification of the establishment figure, probably the worst profile you could create to run in 2016, a year in which people did in fact want somebody who would be a change agent. Hillary Clinton looked like that, not at all. So anyway, I think that Donald Trump arrives and says, basically, my mission, I was sent here to change. So he changes everything. He changes the way the presidency is conducted. He changes the way he communicates with the Washington establishment. He changes the way he communicates with the American public. And so people ask all the time, and we have asked in polls, as others have, do you like this idea that the president tweets all the time? And invariably, 70% of the people, including 70% of the people who support Donald Trump, say, no, I don't like it. He persists. Why? He believes that he's changing the way presidents communicate with and interact with the American public. He thinks he's going over the heads of people like you and me, sorry, and he thinks it works. So he doesn't really care. What's he trying to do right now with Jeff Sessions? Clearly, he wants him to quit. It's not very hard to figure out. You don't do this. Now, the way this traditionally is done in Washington is if you want somebody to quit, you get somebody on your staff. Jerry, why don't you go leak some nasty comments to somebody in the press or everybody in the press, keep me out of it. Well, that's not Donald Trump's style. Donald Trump's style is to take it on head on. I think the problem with that in this situation is that it may actually make it less likely that Jeff Sessions resigns, because if he resigns, he's essentially saying the president's right, he needs a yes man at the Justice Department. I don't know he wants to be party of that. If he is fired, I think the first problem is it looks as if the president is turning the machinery of justice, is using that as a kind of a personal apparatus of his own, and it will simply make Democrats say what they said when he fired Jim Comey, which is this all amounts to an obstruction of justice. So if you ask me, is this a constructive path to be on? I don't see it, but Donald Trump, he simply loves doing things that people tell him you can't do.
I also think, and it was interesting being in the Oval Office today, and there the president was there with Gary Cohn, his national economic advisor, with Reince Priebus, the chief of staff, with Ivanka Trump, his daughter, with and advisor, obviously, with Anthony Scaramucci, the new White House director of communications director. I was very struck, actually, and when he's surrounded by all these people, and when he's receiving the advice and the counsel of these people, and maybe acting on that advice and counsel, when he's giving speeches and things like that, he's a very different person. He's much more constrained. His speeches actually, not everybody likes the content necessarily of them, but it's a very different style, and it speaks, he gave a big speech in Europe a few weeks ago about the defense of Western civilization, which was quite well received in a lot of circles. So when he is in that environment where he's essentially his message is being channeled with those people around him, it's a different kind of message. And I realized today, perhaps one thing about the tweeting is that it's kind of a liberation for him. Part of it is he's actually escaping the straitjacket that surrounds any president when he comes into office. Those speech writers and advisors and cabinet members and officials and military and diplomats and all those people around him constantly, obviously, injecting what some people would describe as kind of common sense and a more straightforward and a more diplomatic and a more politically acceptable approach. And so tweeting for him, he can just get out of that, or he can go and give an interview and get out and break out of that. And I think it's partly, and you kind of just hinted at this too, in a curious way, and I know not a lot of people not everybody necessarily likes the way Donald Trump is governing, but you kind of hinted at this too, that there's a curious kind of honesty to it, right? So instead of having his advisors go away and tell the press, essentially rubbish Jeff Sessions, he's coming straight out and doing it himself. And it is an interesting form of communication. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say that everything that Donald Trump says is a paragon of honesty, but it's an interesting approach that he uses it not only to get over the heads of people like us in the mainstream media, but actually to escape, in a way, all those people around him who kind of keep saying, oh, you can't do that, you mustn't do that, you've got to behave normally. No,
he doesn't want to be managed, he won't be managed. And somebody told me an interesting story last week that one of his lawyers, and there now are many around, but went in and had a conversation with him and came out and said, I've convinced him. He's going to stop tweeting. And this person who I was talking with heard this and laughed and said, you're about the fifth person who's come out of a meeting with Donald Trump and says, I've convinced him to stop tweeting. It's not going to happen. The one thing you figure out about Donald Trump, and you and I both talk to him periodically, is he's not going to change. He's a 7-year-old successful person, and he believes he understands his own unique path to success. And so you may like it, you may not like it. You should not think it's going to change. It's not going to change. I think that he does. I think one of the flaws of this approach is that it bespeaks a certain mistrust, not just of his enemies, but of his own staff. And I think that becomes dangerous and potentially corrosive, because it says to everybody around him, only I can communicate for myself. I don't trust any of you to do it for me. At some point, this being president is a tough job, and at some point you need a support system that you actually have confidence in. And I think that's a potential downside of this that hasn't really been explored yet. You need help to be president, and I'm not sure he feels like he's got help, and that's a pretty lonely place to be.
The topic of this evening's conversation is media and journalism and truth in the age of Trump. Again, Jerry, you've been around Washington a long time. You've covered many administrations. And you've been covering this one now for 6 months, and you covered the Trump campaign as a commentator as well. Tell us a bit about what is different about. And you just said, by the way, you don't see these, that you've never seen this before. Tell us, in your view, what is different from the point, from the, setting aside the tweeting, from the point of view of the media and the way in which this administration interacts with the media.
Well, look, you have to understand, for starters, that the relationship between any politician and the press, particularly a president and the press, is at its heart an adversarial one. We're not there to cheer. We're there to challenge and to be skeptical. That's true with every president. It's true with the press corps and any of its many iterations and whatever the platforms and technology are. That's the nature of the relationship. So that's a given. What's different here is I think the hostility is just simply much greater. It is on both sides. I think the press has been very harsh and very skeptical, and I think Donald Trump in the campaign very effectively used us in the press as a foil to appeal to his base. So there was kind of a mutual animosity that developed from the very beginning, and it has simply taken root and has blossomed, if that's the right word. And so I think the adversarial relationship, which is inevitable and natural, is simply much more pronounced in this case. Now, it's also exacerbated a little bit by the fact that the president does not think that the press is his only way of communicating, and when this goes back to the Twitter point, I think he believes that he went around and he's right. He went around the country in 2015 and 2016 communicating directly with his voters at rallies that filled halls with 10, 15, 20, 25,000 people at a time. And I think he believes he has a special channel of communication that's all his own, and that anybody who stands in the way of that, and that means CNN or whoever it might be, is simply getting in the way of him doing the job the way he sees the job. And so it's a completely different dynamic. As I said, the adversarial relationship is a given, but the way it's played out is just totally different in this case.
One of the most important characteristics of the circumstances we're dealing with, the environment we're in, is a pretty profound and pervasive lack of trust. I think this has been widely commented on as a broader social phenomenon. There's been a decline in trust over the last few decades, not just in government and in politicians, but in some of the institutions of American society, to some extent the church, the various churches, through the scandals that they've been through, corporations through the scandals that we've had, the financial sector after the financial crisis. Perhaps one of the few institutions that's been relatively untainted by this decline in trust is the military, but we can talk a bit about that separately. But you've seen this really pervasive decline in trust, and there is no question that there has been a significant decline in trust in the media. And you ask people, and we ask this, we do these polls all the time. I'm glad to say the Journal still fares well, but if you ask people whether or not they, and we had this very recently, ask Americans, do they trust what Donald Trump said? Do they believe what Donald Trump says? Or do they believe the way the most important media, the mainstream media, report it? It's about 50-50 between people. If you ask Republicans, it's like 85% think Donald Trump is more trustworthy than the media. there has just been a massive decline. Now, I think, by the way, before we get sort of on our high horse about it, I think we are responsible for a lot of that decline in trust. I think the way in which the media has behaved in the last 20, 30 years has unfortunately contributed to a decline in the trustworthiness of media institutions, the way we've chosen to do stories, the way media has become more partisan, the way it's become much more involved in the fray. But this does pose a real threat to our ability as a society, I think as a democracy, to have an effective and honest conversation, the kind of conversation that's necessary for government to take place, for effective democratic government to take place. You have, you just don't have an agreement anymore on basic facts. People don't. If the New York Times publishes something, half the country doesn't believe it because they think it's a liberal conspiracy. If perhaps the Wall Street Journal but more importantly, say Fox News does its reporting, more than half the country doesn't believe that for the same reason. If you don't have agreement around a common set of facts, how on earth do you think democracy can function?
I worry about this a lot. There was this, Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said famously, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. But that idea is not really accepted anymore. And forget journalism, what about society? How do you proceed as a society if there is truth, there are facts. And one of the things that I think has happened is that the nature of the media has changed in the sense that when I started in this business, objectivity was the highest goal. That was what you strove to achieve. And I think that at this point there are now news outlets, and in the era of the internet, this is easy to do. You can start your own liberal, conservative, libertarian, or vegetarian or vegan website, by declaring you're doing it and setting up shop in your basement and doing it. And so I think a lot of people have had a hard time figuring out what is the media today, what is press today. I think there's a second trend, though, Jerry, that I think has contributed to this, which is at the same time, and maybe these two things are cause and effect, maybe they're just moving on parallel tracks, but there's been an overall decline in the tenor and the character of the national debate generally. I mean, it is really the nastiness in public discourse is really discouraging to me, and I think dangerous ultimately. You don't want to attribute motives to people, but somebody did walk up to a baseball field in Alexandria, Virginia, about a month ago and start shooting at politicians. And there's been violence against reporters. Where does this end? I think that the political class has a certain obligation here as well to try to create an environment in which there is civil discourse, that people disagree agreeably, and that you have a debate, and at the end of the day, you agree that there are some common values on which people can agree. Right now, that's all missing, and I think these two things have combined to create what I would describe as a very toxic environment.
And I do think, rather than seeing this and the age of Donald Trump as a sudden arrival out of nowhere, the barbarians at the gate or whatever, I think it is important to see this as more of a continuum, actually. I do think one of striking example of that sort of hyper-partisanship, refusal to accept not only the arguments of the other side, but the very legitimacy of the other side, is political debate, as you say, very much about political discourse, with regard to politics and the presidency over the last 20 years. And it's very striking to me, in the 1990s, the Republicans tried to impeach and remove from office Bill Clinton on the grounds that he had lied and obstructed justice. They were unsuccessful, but it established a kind of base, if you like, for delegitimizing the presidency. Then George W. Bush came in 2001, and there were many, many Democrats who said he's not a legitimate president. The Supreme Court stole the election. He's not my president. It's completely legitimate. They said the same thing in 2004 when he was reelected. That there was a question of whether or not Ohio whether there'd been electoral fraud in Ohio. So for much of the left, George Bush was not the legitimate president. Obama comes in 2009, and again, for a significant part of the country, troop birthers, whatever you want to call them, he's not a legitimate president because he wasn't born in this country, supposedly. And now Donald Trump has come in, and again, he didn't win the popular vote. He's been delegitimized. This has been going on, unfortunately, for a long time, not just a disagreement about policy and the direction of the country, but an attempt actually to impeach the very basis of your opponent's views, and to say not only are you wrong, not only are your opinions wrong, not only are your facts wrong, but they're actually legitimate. And I think that's part of what you're talking about.
Exactly. And now there's an additional factor, which is the very legitimacy of an election. The substance of democracy is now being called into question, from both sides, and voter fraud and all of that. And again, where does that stop? I'm not sure I know where it stops. I think that there's an additional factor here, though, and this is a little bit of political science 202, but there is a polarization in the country that is very obvious, and it feeds into this in Washington. Part of that is simply because I think people have separated out in society that the middle of the country where I'm from is very red. The coastal areas are very blue. That's partly self-selection. People move to live with people that they agree with. But part of it is also the political system. The business of drawing up congressional districts in this country has been, for the last 30 or 40 years, turned into a science of political polarization. And people who agree with each other on the conservative side all live together, and they elect the same kinds of people, and people who agree with each other on the liberal side live together and are grouped in congressional districts where they elect the same kind of people. And by the way, those people don't have to talk to anybody they disagree with. The voters don't, and the politicians don't. They're safe if they simply agree with the people who make up the majority of their district, and they're safe if they don't talk to anybody in Washington who disagrees with them, because the surest way to lose your job is to cross over and talk to somebody from the other side and make the pure red or the pure blue district back home mad at you. So there are these massive disincentives to have the kind of dialogue we're talking about. Civil discourse does not bring its own rewards in our political system today.
And the more partisan we become, the greater the problem becomes. It is a vicious circle, I think. I mean, President Obama was able to achieve a number of major legislative successes. The stimulus when he first came in, Obamacare, most obviously. He achieved them without a single Republican vote in either House of Congress. And that's now, unfortunately, kind of the model for the way you get things done. I mean, the president now is trying, and he had a significant success today in moving the Republican health care plan forward. But again, he did it. The entire discussion here is about whether or not they can bring all the Republicans along, because the Democrats are going to oppose everybody. The Democrats have opposed the vast majority of his nomination to a man and a woman. They're opposing his other legislative plans. This seems to feed on itself, that with each new administration, with each new Congress, you get this entrenched partisanship. In the past, when even Ronald Reagan got tax cuts passed with the support of Democrats. You had even Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s with the Great Society reforms. There were a significant number of liberal Republicans who were willing to go along and vote for them. You just don't seem to have any prospect anymore of anything getting done unless a party has a solid majority in both houses of Congress, and that can't be good for the long-run health of the country.
No, and I look. I mean, politicians are human, believe it or not. They respond to stimuli, and the stimuli basically reward them for being partisan. And I think there's a certain responsibility voters have to assume here, not to be corny about it, but I mean, the politicians are not punished for being obstructionists. They're rewarded for being obstructionists. Okay, if you turn the risk-reward ratio around as voters, then you'll get a different behavior, because politicians will respond to the stimuli. And I just don't think that's happening right now. And part of it's because of this polarization in the country itself, but part of it, I think, is because voters haven't spoken up and made the statement that says essentially this is not what we voted for. I think that one of the things that troubles me right now, Jerry, is that there's been a process underway in the Republican Party for the last 10 or 15 or 20 years in which what I just described, which is the base rises up and punishes you in the form of finding a primary opponent to run against you if you move too far away from the ideological line. Democrats are now proceeding down the same path, exactly the same path. What really happened, and you guys, you're from New York, you're in Chuck Schumer's hometown, you saw it happen here. Donald Trump starts the administration by with an action that riled up the Democratic base. It was the travel ban. It was seen as partisan and ideological from the left, and they pounced on it. Chuck Schumer had come into office saying to us in an interview, frankly, in December, I believe that I'm closer to Donald Trump on infrastructure and on trade than most Republicans are. We're going to work together on some things, those two things in particular. That's actually what Chuck Schumer thought. The travel ban hit. The crowd started to form outside his house over in Brooklyn, and the message went out. The base will now do to Democrats who waver from the line of resistance what Republican base voters have done to Republicans for 20 years. And so in a way, we're backed further away from the kind of coming together that we're talking about and that some people want. And I don't know how we break out of that cycle.
Okay, before coming to questions from the audience, which I'm sure there are many, I'm going to do something which I'm going to ask you to do something which I know you hate doing, which is I'm going to ask you to
Thanks
make.
for the
I'm going to ask you a few questions and make some predictions about what's going to happen. We'll get into the meat of politics in 2017.
I wrote one column that said Donald Trump might win in 2016. Does that count?
You did. Yeah. You were closer than most journalists. Let's be fair. I think it's fair to say. Okay, let's start. So let's start where we started. Jeff Sessions, does he survive as Attorney General to the end of the year?
No.
Okay.
I think the question is, does he quit or does he get fired? I don't know how you can continue to operate under these conditions.
And then, crucially, if that happens, we have this special counsel, Robert Muller, former head of the FBI, conducting his investigation into Russian meddling in the election, and it seems to be spreading into all kinds of investigative areas involving the Trump family. If Sessions goes, does Trump then take that opportunity to appoint someone as Attorney General who's going to get rid of Mueller?
I think not. I think that's probably a bridge too far, even for this very unconventional, very confrontational president. I think that would make all of his problems worse and force a different kind of... and force whoever he would pick to be the successor Attorney General down a path that Donald Trump is hoping that he can avoid. I think he would make the very outcome that he is trying to avoid here more likely.
Next one. Is there any prospect...
Oh, by the way, just as a footnote, the Trump legal team has been trying furiously in the last few days to reel back this idea that he's going to fire Bob Mueller. They have realized, I think, that's explosive, and they want to pull that notion back. So I take that for what it is.
Maybe they'll be as successful with that as they were with stopping him tweeting.
I'm going to interrupt slightly here. I think that they realize that firing James Comey, the FBI director, the way the president did it, did backfire in a huge way. And I think there's a realization. You could have done it in January at the beginning, or you could have just put up with him, but firing him when they did, the way the president did it, made every problem that he's worried about worse. And I think that's a realization that's sunk in.
Well, you're doing very well so far. So Sessions goes, Mueller stays. Where does the Mueller investigation come out? I know this requires knowledge that even you, Jerry, at this stage don't have, but from where this appears to be going and what you're hearing, what's the likeliest outcome of this Mueller investigation?
I will cop out and say I don't know. I really don't know. I think that if they want to prosecute somebody, right now they can probably prosecute Paul Manafort and Michael Flynn for not having registered as foreign agents. That'll be ending with a whimper rather than a bang. The real question here is whether, and collusion is a very slippery term. What does that mean? Did Russian money move into the campaign? Was there a black market in stolen emails? Those are the two key questions, and I just don't think we know the answer yet. I think you would be tempted to say this might all just come a cropper. It might amount to nothing in the end, except that people who are inside the investigative machinery, who have seen things that we haven't seen yet, will say there's something fishy about the way things unfolded in 2015 and 2016, and they say it enough that you're forced to conclude that this is a serious question that's going to take a while to be completely answered.
And is Comey's firing itself, we've heard that this is a subject of investigation for possible obstruction of justice. Could that go anywhere? Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think unwittingly, presumably, the president has created a legitimate question about obstruction of justice that now is going to have to be explored to both its legal and its political limit.
Okay, so this one's not a yes or no question, but what are the odds that President Trump serves out, firstly, a full first term, and secondly, maybe a second term?
I think on the first, nearly 100%. I've never bought the idea that, he's going to be so tired of this, he's going to quit. I mean, I think that requires a suspension of belief about what Donald Trump is like. And I don't, I think impeachment is a long shot. By the way, if the Democrats don't win the House in 2018, you can forget about it, I suspect. On the flip side of that, I find it hard to believe Donald Trump would run for a second term. Yeah. Based on absolutely nothing, and you could all come back in 3 years in the middle of the Trump 2020 presidential campaign, and we can revisit this, and you can ridicule me. I don't think he's having a great time.
Actually, I'm not so sure about that. On having seen him today and having seen him in action, I'm going to venture an opinion. I think there is something about the reality show quality to this presidency, and I don't say that necessarily as demeaningly as it sounds. He enjoys the spectacle. He enjoys the publicity, the attention, the power that he has, such as it is, the way in which he gets his people fighting one another against, for his attention. I think there is something about that. The Apprentice, let's not forget, was an astonishingly successful TV show. It was built around the idea of conflict and gaining the attention of Donald Trump, and I think that's kind of how the presidency's unfolded. But anyway, that's just my own.
But that all avoids the secondary question, which is, if he runs, could he win? And let's face it. I mean, this job approval of 38% or whatever it is.
Yeah.
It's not encouraging.
But they'll come out and vote for it. What's the, so on that, Democratic nominee in 2020?
Oh, God, I have no idea.
No, I'm not asking you if you're going to be the Democratic nominee in 2020. I'm just asking
sure
you.
That's not going to happen. Here's the problem for Democrats. They have a very weak bench. I mean, they just do. I mean, it's just unbelievable if you've been watching politics for a while. And
come on, Oprah?
Who's the
Justin
guy?
Timberlake? You don't think these people could run for president?
Howard Schultz, the guy who runs
Howard Schultz runs Starbucks. Exactly. Bob Iger, CEO of Disney.
Yeah, Cory Booker. I don't know. It's just that you really there was the Clinton dominance of the party. Basically, was a huge shadow that was cast over everybody else for years. Plus the fact that Democrats just did a terrible job over a long period of time of paying attention to the state of the party out in the states. So there are no governor. There are very few governors. There are very few state legislatures. There's no farm team out there that's producing high-quality candidates the way the Republican farm team has been doing it for the last 10 years. So it's a quandary. Now, having said that, politics abhors a vacuum. Somebody will step up. Somebody we're probably not even thinking about and emerge in the next couple of years. I just don't know who it is. There's a cop-out.
Joel, over to you.
Well, thank you very, very much for that. We'd like to go... To give you and the audience the chance to ask a few questions. We don't have a lot of time, but we do have some time. Please wait until the microphone, which my colleague Chris Barthel has, reaches you. There's a question right here.
Two quick questions. One is from each of you. Do you think that Donald Trump is truly mentally, psychologically competent? And question number two, what do you make of his talk about pardoning himself and his team?
Both to you, Jerry. Go for it.
Thank you. Because I am the resident psychiatrist in the room, the psychologist in the room. First of all, I think anybody who runs for president is probably somewhat mentally ill because of the stresses and responsibilities of it. I mean, who knows? Look, I think everybody has their own psychological pathologies and quirks, and I think Donald Trump is, perhaps has some extreme ones. I think he is. Look, I mean, having seen him, I think there is, if I may quote some Shakespeare, there is method in his madness. Actually, I think it's nice for a lot of people, especially sort of commentators in the press who don't like him and who are hostile, to say, oh my gosh, he's mentally ill and we need to, invoke the 20, whatever it was, amendment to get rid of him. There's method to it, and there's method to this tweeting, and there is an intent, and again, it works, right? I mean, and Jerry kind of alluded to this. He connects with his base. His base like this stuff. They like the way he speaks. They like the fact that he speaks bluntly in a way that politicians have never spoken before. They probably like the fact that he goes out there and flays his attorney general and criticizes his secretary of state and attacks people who work for him in the White House. They like that directness and bluntness, and he's managed to achieve whatever else people here, and I know, he didn't get many votes in Manhattan, but whatever people here think, he has achieved a connection with many people in this country that few politicians, and he's not a politician, remember, few politicians have been able to do, and certainly politicians in the last few years have not been able to do. So I think for all the kind of showmanship and the rather sort of grotesqueness sometimes of some of the things he does and the way he behaves, I think it works for him. I think it works with a lot of voters, and I think they like that. I'll leave you to do the second question.
Look, so on pardoning yourself, I think this is a fun parlor game, but I think it's probably a little overdrawn at this point. So let's keep a few practical things in mind. He may or may not be able to pardon himself. There's a legal dispute about that. But it doesn't matter in the sense that what really, the threat to a president is not indictment, it is impeachment. And in impeachment, you cannot pardon yourself. The House indicts you, the Senate votes on your guilt or innocence, and that is, a president cannot pardon himself from impeachment, and that's the real threat facing any president. As an aside, and you all live in New York again, the other thing he probably can't do is pardon himself from prosecution for state offenses. And you guys have some very aggressive, I've heard, some very aggressive prosecutors in New York State who are very interested in Donald Trump. So that's a whole nother legal path of legal peril where a pardon doesn't matter. I think Donald Trump is talking about pardoning himself mostly because he knows it gets people like us riled up.
Hi. With the antics of his and all of that, there's one thing I keep thinking about. These are our children. They are learning that lying and cheating are okay, that it's legitimate. So with all of this, of the antics, the destabilization and the destruction of our institutions, what about our children? That is my question.
Well, look, I wasn't happy when he stood up before the Boy Scouts yesterday and said, why the hell would I talk about politics? Why are you saying that before the Boy Scouts? But anyway, let's leave that aside for a second. Look, I'm a parent of 3. I don't think you should be using politicians as role models for your kids anyway. So, but and I don't mean that to be flip. I honestly mean that. I do worry about the question that you raised, and I worry about it in a broader way. I worry about it in the context of what I said a little bit earlier, which is, it is Donald Trump, but it's the general demise, decline, deterioration of civil conversation in this society. That's what I worry about. And that's Donald Trump. It's most of the political system. It's most of what you hear on cable TV. And it's a huge amount of what you can, what you can hear on the internet any 24/7. So I totally am with you on this, but in a broader way. That's, I guess, what I would say.
I'm a father of 5 daughters, and believe me, the discourse in our house is rarely very civil. So I don't blame Donald Trump for that.
You have girls. I don't know about that.
The next question is this gentleman back here.
Hi, thank you. It was a very informative talk. Question I have is, do you feel that Donald Trump has mortally wounded mainstream media? And it's a combination of 2 factors. One, people are going away from traditional media because they have more options. And two, he's constantly hammering it. And the second part of my question is, do you feel the mainstream media is responsible partially for this? Because for 8 years, people felt that they can't say anything against Obama, and also that people feel that culturally, that if they say anything different than mainstream media, they'll be considered racist or whatever other epithets and now they feel they're being liberated.
Let me say on the first point, look, I think there's a paradox. I think you have a good point. There's a paradox, though, here, which is on the one hand, Trump has done a very good job of attacking and undermining the mainstream media, which I said we're already suffering from a significant lack of trust. He's made that trust, he's weakened that trust even further. On the other hand, he's been the best thing that's happened to CNN, for example, in the last 20 years. I mean, the audiences, their ratings, their advertising revenue, same with the New York Times, who are not friendly. Neither of those institutions would describe themselves as friendly to Donald Trump. So the paradox is that even as he's been attacking these institutions, and even has been undermining, I think you're right, the trust in those institutions for a lot of Americans, he's actually been sort of ginning up support for those institutions from people who are very strongly opposed to him. So I think actually what he's doing is he's accentuating this partisanship that I think is now so prevalent in so much of public life and in the media life. And secondly, and I'll let Jerry answer too, but on your second point, as I said again, I think you have a point. I think the media, unfortunately, has tended... The media for too long has presented itself, much of the media, not all the media, has presented itself as objective purveyors of the truth, even as they were largely led by and peopled by journalists who had a particularly strong political view, and it tended to be in one direction. And I think that led to, in the 1990s, the creation of Fox News, because people were very frustrated with what they saw as the main television news networks, either CNN network or the news as it appeared on the major networks. They felt it was not fair. They felt it wasn't fair. It wasn't objective. And so Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes saw a great opportunity there to do news for people who were really, really unhappy with what they were seeing. So I think the media has contributed to this problem. I think it has contributed to a lack of trust, and I think that's where we are right now. And I think it's contributed to this accelerating partisanship that unfortunately does now make it so hard for news organizations to pursue and to publish and to win support for the objective truth.
We've got time for two more questions. One here.
I asked for Donald Trump.
Well,
And I think
no, the lady just behind you. I'm sorry. I pointed to the lady behind you.
First, thank you for the wonderful hour of entertainment. Besides sheltering our youth from poor syntax, what would happen if the press didn't print or talk about the tweets?
Well, I thought about that this morning, as a matter of fact. Look, he's the president of the United States. He is clearly using Twitter to make what amount to official pronouncements. I just don't think you could ignore it. We've talked about this because some of it seems frivolous and skippable, but in the main, you cover Washington, you're covering the government, you're covering the president. You have to pay attention, and I think it would be a dereliction of our duty to simply ignore it because we don't like the format.
Let me just add, I think it would deepen mistrust in the media because many people would see this as an attempt by the media to deny access to the media by the President of the United States. And I think that half of the country, or the 38% of the country, whatever it is that right now strongly approves of Donald Trump, would say that's typical of the mainstream media. They're actually refusing even to report on the President of the United States when he says important things. How biased can you get? And I think it would be counterproductive.
The final question right here.
I voted for Donald Trump. I'm for him. I love the tweets because it's the only way we get the truth. And my question is, he's the only one really truthful to me. My question is, he's the President of the United States. Many of us are for him and admire him, what he's doing and what he wants to do for this country. And why can't the press be more respectful of him? I think it's dangerous not to. It shows our enemies that we're all distrusting and making fun of him. I think he's been fabulous. I give him so much credit for staying with it.
We've
but
heard the question. We've heard the question.
Why can't the press be respectful of him? He's the president, and he's a great one. Thank you.
Well, look, it's a serious question. I think you should not confuse tough coverage with disrespectful coverage, and they're not the same thing. I mean, as I said earlier, and this applies to Barack Obama, who was not pleased with the press all the time either. We're not in the cheerleading business, we're in the coverage business. That's the first thing that I would say. Second thing I would say is, I think that I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but I mean, there's part of the attacks on the press that Donald Trump's picked fights with the press too. It's a two-way street, and he called us the most dishonest people on earth during the campaign, and I think there's been a certain natural reaction to that. But I also understand that you have to just check all that at the door if you're in our business. You just go to work and do your job. You're not trying to be respectful or disrespectful. You're just trying to be honest and objective. And that's a challenge in this environment because, and trust me, I write a column regularly for the Journal, and I'm amazed in this environment where the same piece of journalism, the same column, you'll get these emails in which people attack you from the left for being too soft on Trump and in the tank for him, and from the right for being part of the mainstream media that's ganging up on Donald Trump for the exact same piece of journalism. So part of this is the environment that we're in, and I think in the midst of that environment, you just try to do journalism the way it's supposed to be done, and not worry about it.
I know that not a lot of people in the audience clearly agree with your view, but I don't disagree with you. I think a lot of the media have been pretty disrespectful. I think this is part of what Jerry was talking about earlier, this tone of incivility that has entered into so much of discourse. Unfortunately, a lot of the press have picked that up. I think some of the mainstream press do it, but certainly some of the more partisan press certainly do it and behave in an incredibly disrespectful way. And it is a difficult balance always, because this is the President of the United States. He's the head of state. He deserves to be treated with respect, I think of that. But what he doesn't deserve to be treated with is deference. And I think that is the difference here. I think it's important to have a robust, free press that reports on what is going on, that challenges what's going on, that exposes things that are going on that are questionable and that should be open to examination, but does it in a respectful way. And I think some of the tone sometimes isn't respectful, but I absolutely defend the journalism. It's very important to do the journalism to whether it's a Democratic president, a Republican president, a president, an unorthodox president like this one or a more orthodox one. It's our job to report as best we can on the facts, to expose those facts that people don't want exposed, and whoever they are, and to take that responsibility seriously. It's a very important role that we play to help illuminate what's going on in this country, and in the end, it produces, I think, better governance.
Well, I'd like to thank both of you, Jerry and Jerry. I think you've carried on this discussion in the very spirit of Bishop Fox, of free and unbridled inquiry into wherever the facts lead us. And sometimes we disagree about that, but I think it was a wonderful discussion. I hope everybody can stay for the reception and continue the discussion. If you have not yet seen the exhibition in the Yeshiva University Museum Gallery, the Popper Gallery, just on the left side in the Great Hall, please be sure to go in there before you leave this evening. Thank you all very, very much for coming.